Welcome back. In this lesson, we will be talking about sexual abuse and God the Mother, about healing sexual abuse and religious addiction. So, I'm going to start out with a story. Once upon a time, an international meeting was held on an American ship. In rough seas, the ship crashed into a rock. Water gushed in. The American captain, realizing the fast sinking ship had but one small lifeboat. He went on the deck and tried to convince everyone to jump and swim for shore. He returned in frustration and told the American co-captain that nobody would jump, for they feared drowning. The co-captain said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." 5 minutes later, the co-captain called the captain to the deck. Sure enough, everyone had jumped. As feared, all who had jumped had drowned. So the captain asked the co-captain, "How'd you get them to jump?" The co-captain said, "Oh, it was easy. I told the British that it was proper to jump, the French that it was stylish, the Irish to offer it up, and the Germans that it was commanded. Finally, I told the Italians it was forbidden to jump, and they jumped too." Then it occurred to the American captains that they did not have to use the lifeboat either. After all, they were insured. They jumped and they drowned. Regardless of how good a family or a culture that we come from, all of us carry wounds that can make us jump at the wrong times. This is because none of our families are God, thus, none of our families are perfect. And it can be easy to formulate a list of ways that we were wounded as a child. We might even find partners as adults that help us to heal from those wounds. Marriage and family therapists are needed in this regard. Harville Hendricks' theory that the intensity of romantic love comes from our body's heartfelt joy over having finally found that person who can heal us of our wounds. Healing can really happen because we pick a spouse, someone who's like our parents, to help us to recall our childhood wounds. But it's also different to provide us with what we didn't get. Thus, one of the many healthy relationships that a husband and wife can have is that of reparenting one another. And just like in those relationships, so too with God. The more we allow God to reparent us, the more intense that love relationship is with God. We not only become like our parents whom we adore, but also like the God that we adore. Healing of self-righteousness can happen when we change our image of God. It's not that we no longer see the mistakes and the errors in others, but rather we usually see the same thing in ourselves, so we no longer feel distant from that person. And this change can happen because instead of a judgmental God, we now view a God who reparents us by loving us in shameful memories that we bury and forgot because we feared God's harsh punishment. When I was in high school, I didn't date anyone formally. I had crushes, but I never really acted on going on a date with anyone. I was almost an adult before I had my first kiss. Why was I so scrupulous, and why didn't I ever date? Well, in the culture in which I grew up, the heroes were priests, religious sisters, and the Blessed Mother. All were celibate, and they wore these flowing religious garb that made them look bodiless. They were so asexual that I actually remember how shocked I was in middle school when I discovered that priests went to the bathroom. And then shortly afterward, I began wondering if it was possible that religious sisters did too. I took on many of the bodiless attitudes I perceived in my pastors and religious teachers. They taught endless rules about the do's and don'ts of sexuality. Any infringement was a serious sin and especially offensive to God, who, it seemed to me, saw sexuality as bad. I might be bad too, I thought, because I didn't see how I could ever live up to those rules. I remember seeing the adult magazines on the shelf at a gas station with those black slates in front of them and peeking at one of the covers. I instantly felt shameful and guilty for having looked. I was frightened that I had committed a mortal sin. I spent many weeks wondering if I was in mortal sin and afraid if there would be an accident I would die and my soul would immediately go to hell. In today's world, death can be constantly on everybody's minds. Death can seem like a daily possibility. It can make a person feel as though their soul is in danger at any given moment without constant confession. After confessing, what happens if later that day I experience an impure thought as I again dwell on that image in the magazine? A perfect act of contrition is the only prayer that can forgive moral sins outside of confession, obviously in the Catholic religion. The act of contrition goes like this: Oh my God, I am heartily sorry for having offended thee. I detest all my sins because I dread the loss of heaven and the pains of hell, but most of all because they have offended thee, my God, who art all good and deserving of all my love. This act of contrition is perfect only if detesting all of our sins comes from the result of having offended God, who is deserving of all of our love and who is good, and not as a result of just dreading the loss of heaven and the pains of hell. So, in other words, you have to be concerned about loving God and not about saving your own skin. And this leads us to constantly not measuring up. As I grew and the normal teenage sexual feelings happened, my fear and my shame increased. And this can lead to somebody burying their feelings under even more religious practices. In short, someone can become a religious addict going to confession, daily mass, visiting the blessed sacrament, and multiplying every religious practice possible in order to save their own soul. So the cycle becomes going to the confessional because you have a fear of dying without confession, so then you confess, and then you have normal sexual feelings, so that fear and that shame increase, and then we start to bury our feelings under even more religious practices, and then we go back to confession, and the cycle never ends. So I dreamed that I was hurriedly riding my bicycle to the airport. I knew I was going to be late for my airplane, so I was relieved when I spotted a yellow taxi parked in front of a house. I rang the doorbell, and a woman holding a faceless, blob-like child answered the door. I said, "I need a cab driver to help me catch my plane." The woman responded, "The driver's going to be right out with you," and then closed the door. No driver ever came, so I rang the doorbell again. When the woman opened the door, I asked, "Well, where's the cab driver?" Pointing to the faceless blob in her arm, she said, "He is your cab driver." I knew that the dream meant that if I wanted to catch my plane and get to where I'm going in life, I needed to help that faceless blob, my inner child, to grow up. So in the following weeks, I dialogued inwardly with the woman, letting her tell me my childhood history and how I became a bodiless, faceless blob. I've already shared a lot of what that woman told me, but there is more to the story from my infancy. So to introduce that, I want to share someone's experience with a baby named David. One evening when David was 4 months old, his grandparents and uncle were visiting his mother, Mary. David began crying. As she heard David's crying, Mary was on her way to David's room to pick him up. But her father stopped her and said, "That baby just wants attention and you're going to spoil him. Wait until he stops crying and then go pick him up." What followed was this very long and heated discussion. David had such a frightened face when Mary finally picked him up 20 minutes later. One look at David convinced her that she would have to continue disagreeing with her father. She picked David up and held him tightly and apologized for the way that she had ignored him. And much like David, as we grow up, we learn that when we cry, nobody's going to come pick us up. We learn that crying is not welcome. But to shut off crying, we have to shut off the feelings and the needs that cause it. And as we do so, the fright on our faces fades away and we become these faceless blobs. This faceless blob reminds us that every culture has blind spots. A lot of writers have addressed the blind spot of not picking up a crying baby for fear of spoiling him or her. And the view of discipline, even though in David's case was carried out with the most loving intentions, leads us to disconnect from our bodies. And we know that some babies who are not picked up literally disconnect by shutting down their bodies and die of an illness called marasmus. The main way a baby communicates those urgent messages of its body is through crying. Suppose, for instance, that a baby needs to be held. If the baby cries to express this need and someone comes and lovingly holds it, the child then can think, my needs must be good because they bring me all this care. Therefore, the needs I feel in my body must be good and I am good. On the other hand, if the child's cry is not answered, the child thinks the opposite. The needs that I feel in my body only bring abandonment. Therefore, my body must be bad and I must be bad. So rather than constantly face intense feelings of abandonment, a baby's going to shut down its own body. And this type of discipline, which triggered deep feelings of abandonment in me, taught me to shut down my body, not to feel what I feel, think what I think, and trust what I trust. Shutting down our bodies in this way is the root of addiction. And addiction is the use of any substance or process to escape reality, especially painful feelings. In my case, even as a baby, I shut down my body as a way to escape painful feelings of abandonment. And addiction is also our best attempt to belong. Shutting off my body was my best attempt to get what I needed in order to belong. When my body was shut off and therefore unable to communicate troublesome needs, I felt safe. One can become a religious addict using ejaculatory prayers and external rituals to keep themselves from feeling what they feel or thinking what they think or trusting what they trust. Another way to speak about the journey back into your body is the journey into the feminine side. An example of how estranged one person was from his feminine side is how clumsy he was at senior prom. This guy, he feared dancing because instead of living in his body, he lived mostly in his mind, graduating in the upper 2% of his class. So instead of developing his feminine side through learning dance and music and art, he learned math and science. He prayed to both the masculine God the Father and the feminine, the Blessed Mother, but to him, they weren't equal. Only the masculine father was God. So it was in his life. The masculine was God, and he was ill at ease with girls as he was with his feminine side. And as we grow up, we learn this wisdom about the interior life. But where this wisdom is often distorted is by male clericalism. We're left with this masculine skew. We are great at getting things done and thinking for ourselves and finding the God out there. We don't develop that feminine value of simply just being, listening to feelings and body wisdom and finding the God within. Erik Erikson's essay, Womanhood and the Inner Space, really just broadens our understanding of this experience. Erikson describes the way that the masculine physiologically and psychologically emphasizes outer space, while the feminine focuses on the inner space. And he suggests that the masculine image of God is more transcendent. Mighty God who is out there, always inviting us to change and grow. And we do try everything from being celibate to daily confession and prayer. Some things help, but others don't. We still need that feminine side of God. In contrast to the masculine side, Erikson describes the feminine side of God as more immanent, a God who is within, who's present in whatever we're experiencing. This God communicates with us through dreams, breastfeeding us, massaging us just as we are. With her, we can just be. She doesn't utter a word about how we should change or grow. We need to be cared for by both sides, just as we need a mother and a father figure as we grow as children. So let's talk about the sexual abuse for a second. Often we think of sexual abuse, we think of physical or genital abuse. And perhaps sexual abuse also happens in many other ways. And with any illness or dysfunctional behavior, until we're honest about all the ways it manifests itself, we're caught in denial and we're unable to recover from it. Some experiences of childhood spiritual abuse can be considered normal, even healthy behavior by Catholics until, there was the Vatican II. Although people had an awareness of obvious spiritual abuse in previous centuries, such as, the religious persecution of the Jews, they were often unaware of how it was happening to them every day. And then once the Vatican II gave us a new version of what is healthy, we moved to a new level of awareness to what is spiritual abuse. Many behaviors that before we considered normal, we could now recognize as spiritual abuse, name them as that, and thus begin recovering from them. And just as greater awareness helps us to recognize and recover from spiritual abuse, so also with sexual abuse. Getting through denial is important. The all-male image of God is also a form of sexual abuse. So are the teachings of and the religious practices that made us afraid to date and separated us from our sexuality. This is, more metaphorical in a broader sense to include any way that we are not encouraged to develop and trust both the masculine and feminine sides of our personality and also of our image of God. So as someone in a helping profession, we can really help our clients to both strive for change, but also to accept and love themselves where they are. We can help them to work things out, but also value interconnectedness, and that includes other human beings, a friend, a support group, a therapist, what have you. We can't just tell the story of the prodigal son from Luke 15:11 through 32, in which God the Father throws a party and welcomes us home, and just completely skip over the story just above that describes a woman who found the lost coin. In this story, it describes how God the Mother also wants to throw a party and welcome us home. None of us can grow any faster than our own image of God. None of us can relate to an only male God without stunting the growth of our feminine side. Developmentally, what each person is growing into is the image of God. As Eckhart wrote, the seed of God is within us. Now the seed of a pear tree grows into a pear tree, and a hazel seed grows into a hazel tree. A seed of God grows into God. In other words, each person is developing the face of God. We need to sense a congruence between our own identity and our image of God in order to keep growing. And if we don't have both sides of God, we either have to abandon God as God has been presented to us, or we have to abandon our own growth. We betray our potential to become integrated human beings. Although some experiences may never include physical sexual abuse, recent insights into the causes of child molestation by clergy can help us to understand how we might become stuck in psychosexual development. The report of the Archdiocese Commission on Inquiry into the Sexual Abuse of Children by members of the clergy that was issued in 1990 by the St. John's Newfoundland Archdiocese says it is without exception the most important statement on celibate or sexual morality issued under the church auspices in the past 50 years. The report says that the patriarchal clerical structure of the Roman Catholic Church creates a climate that significantly contributes to child sexual molestation by priests. Commenting on this report and based upon his 25 years of studying the celibate clerical system, A.W. Richard Sipe of the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine says, it's clear that the institutional church is in a pre-adolescent stage of psychosexual development. This is a period typically prior to 11 years of age in which boys prefer association with their own sex. Girls are avoided and they're held in disdain, often as a guise for fear of women as well as their own as yet unsolidified sexuality. Sex generally is rigidly denied externally while secretly explored. The rigidity extends to strict rules of inclusion and exclusion. Control and avoidance are a primary concern. This institutional structure, although it surely includes individuals who have matured beyond it, is dominated and entrenched in a level of functioning that cannot face the sexual realities of adolescence, let alone mature male and female equality and sexuality. So as Richard Sipe suggests, a church stuck in the pre-adolescent stage of development is limited in its ability to cope with sexual issues and give sexual guidance, as that other guy that I was telling y'all about at his senior prom. A lot of Catholics are going to question the church's guidelines in sexual matters like divorce and remarriage, birth control, abortion, homosexuality, mandatory celibacy for priests, women's ordination, and limiting ultimate decision-making to males. Many such people cherish the church's good values, such as the sacredness in all instances of human life, the institution that reproduction is a sacred link to God's creativity, and the sacramental value of married love. However, these values are often lost in discussion of sexual issues. One reason this happens may be that the institutional church interpreting and promoting these values is often stuck in a pre-adolescent stage of psychosexual development. Thus, the main message many people hear is not the church's good values, but rather an underlying fear of women and sexuality. It's this negative, fearful attitude that many people may be rejecting when they question the church's teachings on sexuality. So this is an example we can use with our clients. It's the healing process. We can have them to recall a time you held a child in your arms. Perhaps it was your own child. Perhaps it was a grandchild, a niece, a nephew, or the child of a friend. Recall the love in your heart toward that child. How good and precious it seemed to you, and your desire to protect it and give it every good thing. Or if you prefer, recall holding a pet. Now imagine yourselves in the arms of God the Mother. If you cannot imagine God the Mother, rest in the arms of your mother, your grandmother, or any other woman who's given you God's motherly love. Be aware that she holds you as lovingly as you held that child. She sees you as good and precious. She wants to protect you and give you every good thing. Rest in the arms of God the Mother. Perhaps recalling the words of Isaiah 49:15. Can a mother forget her infant or be without tenderness for the child of her womb? Even should she forget you, I will never forget you. Breathe deeply, filling yourself with love, with her love for you.